Hi everybody, it's Miss Kennedy. I'm back. It's been forever since I made a video. We're going to kind of wrap up Unit 5 and focus a little bit more on food production and go a bit more into detail about some elements of it. First, I want to start with the community garden in Coney Island. I live out here as well as our school is out here, but we talked about community gardens last week, and I've walked by this one. I've walked past it a million times, but I've never really realized that it's a community garden. But it's here, it's on Mermaid, and I don't know, like 20 in the 20s maybe. But it's not looking great right now because it's winter time. But this one's really fun. They have a lot of stuff going on in this community garden. There's tons of beds where they would grow like vegetables and fruits and stuff. But right now it's dormant. But I thought you should know that there are community gardens everywhere in Brooklyn and all over the city, and it's awesome. It's helping communities get the food that they deserve and that they need. So going into topics we ended with last week, we talked about soil erosion, and I just wanted to kind of summarize it nicely for you. So again, soil erosion is the wearing away or removal of soil, especially the soil at the top or topsoil, from land. So we've seen it throughout the lessons. It's kind of getting erased or swept away or washed away. And some of the causes are wind and water, like I just said. And poor agricultural processes, so farmers not taking care of their land the right way and creating more erosion than necessary. Removing plant communities, stripping the land creates a lot of erosion because those plants helped keep the soil where it was. And waterlogging is another cause of erosion. And it reduces plant growth, causes a loss of soil fertility, or soil overall health, ability to grow. You need more fertilizer to help that eroded soil be fertile and grow stuff, so you have to add more fertilizer. And it leads to sediments from the soil or from the land and fertilizer ending up in our water. So it's like a negative cycle. When we ruin our soil, we have to do more bad things to make it better. So just keep that in mind. We also talked about salinization a few lessons ago, but just to review, it's the buildup or gradual accumulation of salt in the soil. Because of improper irrigation techniques, the water that's being flooded into the land or whatever has a little bit of salt in it, and over time that salt builds up in the soil. And this is really common in arid or semi-arid areas, and those just mean really dry land, really dry soil, really dry climates. So that's really common in those areas where there's not as much water. It's a dry climate. And this can get so bad, the amount of salt, that it's toxic to plants. It kills them, as you can see in this picture, and it's a really negative consequence of improper agriculture or irrigation. All right, so next thing, ooh, no. So how do you fix it? Well, in reality, it's easier to prevent salinization than it is to fix it, because you have a bunch of dead crops and really salty soil, so it's easier to kind of nip it in the bud or the butt before it happens. So don't plant a bunch of crops that require tons of water, or water, they're guzzlers, in really sensitive or dry areas. It's just not a good idea. So you want to be smart about where you put your crops depending on how much the water they need. And then you want to irrigate with low salt water if you can, to minimize the amount of salt that builds up in the soil, which is, a difficult challenge for farmers, but it obviously needs to be a focus. And irrigating efficiently is also a really great fix for this, giving water only to the crops that need it. So a great method to reduce salinization, or prevent it, is to focus on drip irrigation in sensitive areas. So drip irrigation, if you remember, is like you have those little tubes that you see, and they drip water directly onto each plant. So there's a little hole or tube that gives the plant the water, but the rest of the soil stays dry. So it's a good way to minimize the excess water and thus excess salt buildup in soil. So now we're talking about overgrazing. This is when too many animals eat too much of the plants that are covering the land. They just eat and eat and eat, and they overgraze. There is sustainable grazing where you're monitoring your animals so that they don't overgraze. But overgrazing is a huge problem. It impedes or gets in the way of plant growth. It degrades soil because the cows or whatever animal are destroying the soil by just stomping all over it, and compacting the soil. And then they're obviously removing the native grass as well. So it becomes this big problem where it leads to erosion, decrease of the grass and its ability to survive, and it's a huge negative consequence. It can also lead to more invasive species coming into that land because the cows or whatever are eating all of the native grasses and destroying them, which gives the invasives an opportunity to come in and take over the land, which can be really negative if the invasive species is a pest or not, ends up not being good for the cows or something like that. And there are some government subsidies to prevent this, which means the government is paying farmers or giving them a discount or on this or that to incentivize or kind of make them protect their rangelands or their grazing land to avoid this problem. So this is an example of the government getting involved and saying, hey, we'll help you if you stop doing this. Here's a picture of what sustainable grazing would look like. Obviously the grass is regrowing and regenerating. Then you have overstocking, where you're just putting way too many animals in that area, and that leads to overgrazing, and it's not pretty. So legislation is a big part of this unit, a lot of the units to come, because the government was like, this is too much. The whole planet, or science and people who care about the environment, were like, this is too much, and the government got involved to help make things better. Hopefully. So there was the Soil Conservation Act in 1935, which is a long time ago, which formed this Soil Conservation Service, which is also now called the Natural Resource Conservation Service, to help protect our natural resources. They assess soil damage. The legislation as well requires you to assess soil damage and then create more policies to improve soil. And then there was also the Food Security Act, or the Farm Bill, in 85, that basically made farmers with really erodible or future erosion could happen on their soil. They had to change their practices and look at their farming a different way to avoid future erosion. It created the Conservation Reserve Program that pays farmers to stop farming on highly erodible land. So it's kind of like a subsidy for these farmers. So both of these acts, the Soil Conservation Act and Food Security Act, help to maintain or avoid or prevent these future problems like salinization, erosion, and overgrazing and things like that. Sorry, I'm going slow today. The farmers, the steps they can actually take to prevent erosion, it's not just like they can wave a wand, but they can do actual, use new techniques on their farms. So one of those is crop rotation, which we've talked about, putting different crops in different areas of the field and then switching them throughout the season. So you might have, I don't know what this is, whatever vegetable that is growing here one year, and then it moves to the other side, or you put in a whole new crop as the seasons change. You can add cover crops to protect soil. So if you don't have any crops growing and it's just dirt, you can add a cover crop like wheat to protect the land and the soil that the crop is growing on top of. Wheat and corn and soybeans are really good cover crops, and they also can be used and sold later. And then there's contour farming, which I mentioned last week, and this is a really great visual of what contour farming is. So instead of just shaving down this whole hillside, you actually plow these furrows, is what they're called, these yellow lines you see, along the hillside in the direction that the hill is growing in, if that makes sense. So they're perpendicular to the slope, they're not going up the slope in these straight lines. They're kind of using nature or the natural shape of the land to prevent more erosion later. So the crops will not be as eroded. You won't see as much of these things called rills and gullies, where water creates these small little channels of erosion in the soil. Because it's growing with the land, it's kind of elevated at the right angle. You won't see as much of these issues that have been coming up, like erosion. So contour plowing or contour farming is a great way to reduce erosion. There's also shelter belts, or windbreaks, what I believe I called them in the last lesson. They're trees or tall plants that can kind of use them to kind of box off the crops almost, and they put them along the edges of farms or fields to slow down the wind to reduce erosion. So that's another great way to reduce erosion, and also reducing tillage. So tillage is when you go in with these big machines that just rip up all the soil to help make it ready to plant new crops in the next season. And it really does damage the soil because it's ripping it all up and destroying the natural root systems. So reducing tillage is when you, instead of doing that, disturbing the soil and just going for it, You cut these furrows into the soil, which are a little bit more efficient because you're not ripping up all the soil, and you just drop in the seed and then cover that furrow later. So that's reducing tillage. You're still disturbing the soil, but not as much. And then there's no-till farming where you disturb the soil even less. You're trying to be as sensitive and friendly to the soil as possible. There's almost no destruction or ripping up of the soil. A few more, there's terracing, where these platforms are cut into hillsides that contain water. So this is an example of terracing and what it looks like, and it's a great way to reduce that water just rushing down the hills. You're containing it and making it a better way to reduce erosion. Intercropping we talked about as well, planting different types of crops kind of near each other in the same area. So here's a bunch of different crops growing right next to each other. It increases ground cover and helps with biodiversity, and it's another great way to keep your soil healthy and reduce soil erosion. Now we're going to talk about pests super quick. There's a bunch of different pests, but a pest is any organism that damages a valuable crop. So farmers obviously hate pests. A weed is any plant that competes with a crop. So your weeds will always pop up on a farm, and they try and they compete with your crops that are growing for water, soil, and air. So your weeds might even end up killing your crops. So you want to get the weeds out as quick as possible. And to do that, you use things like pesticides. Pesticides are poison that target the pest organism. So whatever it is, weasels, mice, birds, whatever, the pesticides will kill whatever animal eats them, and they're put on the crops. Insecticides do the same thing, but they target insects. Herbicides target plants, so they're used for weeds. And then fungicides target fungus that is growing and potentially destroying your crop. So all these things are designed to keep your valuable crop alive. And we use about 90 million pounds of pesticides in the United States each year, which is crazy. Just think about all the fossil fuels needed to transport those pesticides, and let alone, not even talking about the environmental consequences of them. 75% of that 900 million pounds is applied to agricultural land, and more is added to that percentage over time. And usage of pesticides is also increasing in developing countries and not just in the United States. So it's becoming a much more common method of farming because it's easy and it gets rid of your pests or weeds as quick as possible. So it's a sad way to keep your farm alive. But there's always a consequence. So there's something called pesticide resistance, which is very similar to antibiotic resistance. So I'm going to walk you through this picture here. So first you have a pest, I think that's a dragonfly. It's attacking the crops. So a pesticide is applied, it's dumped over the crops. That's what you're seeing in picture 2. In picture 3, most of the pests die from the pesticide, but these 2 red guys here, they have some sort of mutation in their DNA that allows them to survive. It happens, it's random. So they're able to fight and not be killed by the pesticide. They return, they breed on the crops, and they create an entire population of pests that are resistant to that pesticide. So now all the dragonflies are the red ones that have that mutation. So the next time the pesticide is applied, you see that in picture 5, the pests don't die. There's no effect on the new pest, the resistant pest, and it continues to be a pest, and now it's resistant to the pesticide that you just dumped all over your crops. So we call this a pesticide treadmill. It's a cycle of developing new pesticides, putting them on crops, then the pest becomes resistant. We develop a new pesticide to fight that resistant pest, and it keeps going and going and going. It's a really bad cycle, and it's similar to antibiotics. It can lead, in the future, it will be a major concern if the entire world is filled with bacteria that can fight off antibiotics. What does that mean for human health? If all of our farms are filled with pests that can fight off pesticides, what does that mean for our crops? So something to think about. Very scary for farmers. Here's a look at pesticide use in the entire world, actually. This was in 2017. I'm sure it's a little bit higher depending on the country. But it's very common in these developed countries that we've looked at. The North America, South America, China, Europe, parts of Africa are using a good amount of fertilizer on each hectare of cropland, which is a bunch of acres put together. So it's used all over the world, not just in America. But there are some solutions to this. There's something called integrated pest management, which uses different techniques. There's not one set solution, but multiple techniques to help reduce or suppress pests. So the methods are a little bit more eco-friendly and used together can help reduce your pests. So biocontrol is one of the methods in IPM. So instead of using a pesticide or relying on chemicals, you introduce predators to the pest to help kill them. So let's say you have a bunch of dragonflies, but birds eat dragonflies. So you introduce a bunch of birds to your crop to hopefully kill off the dragonflies. So that's biocontrol. You can use chemicals when necessary, but they are very toxic and can damage your soil. You want to monitor your populations of pests. Make sure you know what the population is doing as you try these different IPM methods. You can alter their habitat, kind of change your farm, add new, landscapes to your farm. And you can also rotate the crops, use transgenic or GMO crops as well. GMO crops that are designed to be resistant towards a specific pest is a great way to reduce that pest. You can rely on those alternative tillage methods to, if you want to start over, try to grow your crop again and focus more on healthy soil. You can use those alternative tillage methods. You can also use mechanical pest removal, which is where you go in with your hands, you pick out the pest, you set a bunch of traps. It's like using your actual labor to reduce the pest. So that's one of the methods. All these methods put together are a little bit more sustainable. So this graph is a kind of interesting look at what happens to the use of pesticides over time in how much they're produced. So the red line is your pesticide production. It's gone down since the late 80s. So has the pesticide subsidy. So the government is no longer giving farmers a cheaper way to buy pesticides. Because of that, they've made less pesticides, but this specific crop has still increased its growth. It hasn't disappeared without the use of pesticides. So it is possible to have healthy crops without pesticides. A lot of people don't necessarily think that that's true, but it is true. So this is a look at a really common pyramid in this class. Remember, the thing at the bottom of the pyramid is always the best for you. The thing at the top is kind of the thing you want to use or access the least. So the bottom of this IPM pyramid is just having good sanitation habits on your farm, changing up the habitat, doing that intercropping or crop rotation to help minimize pests. So that's more of a preventative method. The bottom of the pyramid is more preventative. The top is more about intervention. And as you go up the pyramid, you increase in toxicity. So that cultural change, changing your landscape, changing your farming habits is the least toxic, obviously, because you're not really doing too much to damage the soil or the land or the plants. Then you can go into those mechanical methods next, like we just talked about, using combs to reduce pests, using hands, screens, traps to reduce pests. Then you use those biological methods where you introduce predators or parasites to the crop. It's a little bit more of an intervention, and it's a little bit more dangerous because introducing a new pest or new predator could mess with the natural balance of the ecosystem. And then you have chemical options, which is using pesticides and other sorts of things like repellents, and obviously those are the most toxic. So you want to focus in that green area, and when necessary you can head up into the red area, but ideally most farmers are using IPM like it's a whole balance. It's not just one option. So they're using this holistically to help reduce pests on their farms, ideally. All right, almost done. Next, we're going to talk about CAFOs or CAFOs, whatever you want to call them. They are feedlots or factory farms, basically, but it stands for Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's just a bunch of animals in rows and rows and rows to be fed, to be used for slaughter. This is how we get our meat. So they're huge warehouses or pens designed to deliver this special food that's energy rich. It has all the additives to help that cow or whatever grow as big as possible, as fat as possible, to have the most meat at the end of the day. So over half of the world's pork and poultry come from these feedlots, which is it's just crazy to me. Like, look at these. Look at the not only like the moral implications of the animal health and well-being, but just the amount of land needed, the amount of environmental consequences of these type of concentrated animal feeding operations or feedlots is really scary. And kind of connecting this back to, I think, our first unit, we know that 90% of the energy available is lost every time you move up a trophic level. So starting with plants, you have a lot of available energy, and you have less energy as you move up the food chain. And so the lower on the food chain that we take our food sources from, i.e. eating mostly plant-based, we can support more people because there's less energy needed to farm those things, and they're more energy efficient because you're getting quite a bit of energy out of those food sources. And then some animals can convert grain into meat more efficiently, meaning they can eat their diet of grain and turn that into more meat without additional grain, additional like antibiotics and things added. So if you look over here at this graph, this is how much food is needed to produce like an eatable or edible weight for that animal. So obviously you need tons of wheat, 20 kilograms, which is over 40 pounds for 1 kilogram of beef. So that is tons and tons of grain that we're growing just to support beef, to eat beef. So much of our land goes to feeding the animals that we'll later eat, which I've talked about a lot. But it's just really problematic because all these farming issues are directly connected to the dairy and meat industry. So all of these animals require more food than they create because you're moving up the food chain, you're losing energy. So all of this meat and dairy requires quite a bit of farming to feed them, not even just to, harvest them and eat them. So keep thinking about that when you eat your meat and dairy. But we obviously know that land and water are needed to raise the food for the livestock. Eggs and chicken meat require the least amount of space and water because chickens don't need as much land and don't need as much food as cows and pigs, so you don't need to grow as much. And again, beef requires the most land and water, so it's a huge, huge, huge part of agricultural climate change and agricultural impacts on our environment. We've gotten into this graph. I'm going to end it here, actually. But global meat production is only going up. I'm saying all this like, go vegan, plant-based, woo, but their demand for meat is still there. It's always going to be there, I think, until we make global change. But global change is not in my favor right now. There's a huge demand for meat, and then there's also a huge supply for meat. So every country, every continent has increased its global meat production since the 60s. And look at where we are with our climate. It's not the only reason that our climate is suffering, but it is a major reason. So I wish we could change things, but I just want you to know the facts. Okay, I lied last little bit here. Oh, I don't know where my camera went, but whatever. So we're gonna talk quickly about fisheries and aquaculture, the two ways we get our fish. So if you're a fish lover, here we go. Fisheries are a major source of overharvesting when we talk about overconsumption. Really, we're talking about fisheries in terms of our meat production, because fish in the wild aren't grown for us, right? So we're taking these fish and other sea creatures out of the ocean, and they're not meant to be. Whereas we're growing cows, we're raising cows to slaughter, that's a different story. But fisheries are basically just taking the ocean's resources. And we have crazy sophisticated fishing equipment nowadays. There's like satellite tracking, there's sonar, there's airplanes, there's all these things, all these different equipment, all these different types of hooks and nets to help get as many fish out of the ocean as possible. Sadly, there's something called bycatch, which I'll focus on because it's a big passion of mine. It's really sad. It's where you throw these massive nets towards the bottom that you see, and the boat will just drag the net for a really long time to catch hopefully one thing. But if you drag a net through the ocean, you're not just going to catch tuna, you're going to catch whales, sharks, turtles, and sadly most bycatch is left to die. It's not thrown back into the ocean when the net is pulled up. So bycatch is reducing our biodiversity. It's killing my favorite animals, the turtles. It's killing tons of animals that we don't even eat, but we're so lazy that we're like, it's too much effort, we're going to kill off our bycatch. So bycatch is the extra things that are caught in the net and left to die. There was this Fisheries Act called the Magnuson Fisheries Conservation and Management Act, blah, blah, blah. It was in the 70s. It was all about protecting our fisheries, or not over farming our fisheries, which is just our ocean, really, or areas where you fish in the ocean, and trying to make them as sustainable as possible, but I don't really think it's worked. Oh, my camera is on. Whoops. So I like this graph a little bit better, but this is looking at seafood production over time. So you're looking, the one we just talked about is the red line, which is captured fisheries. So there's way more, over time there was a lot more, that was our main method of catching fish, was through fisheries. But now aquaculture has actually caught up and surpassed how much fish we get globally is mostly based on aquaculture now, and as opposed to captured fisheries. We still do a lot of fishery farming or capturing, but now I'm going to talk about aquaculture so you understand what it is. It's basically growing, it's like feedlots, but for fish. So you're growing these aquatic organisms for us to eat. And it looks like this. It's like almost like a Disney World for growing fish. So it's these actual pieces of land where you set up a whole farm. You have obviously like massive amounts of water. It's monitored, and all the fish are obviously used for kill. They're never released into the wild. And it's a great supply for our food. And they can be sustainable if you have the right support and right, implementation, the right management. But local fisheries can also hurt natural habitats. There's a lot of waste that pollutes the water, and if not done sustainably, can really damage an ecosystem. So that's another way we can get our food. Again, if done right, it can be great. If not, it's not so great. So those are the two ways we get fish, aquaculture and fisheries. So just looking back here, we're doing both now to get lots and lots of fish because there's quite a demand for fish. Neither one is ideal, neither one is sustainable, but those are just the facts on how we eat our fish. So think about it the next time you get sushi. Alright, that's it. I know this was really long. I apologize. I know it's a lot of information as well. But goodbye.